Good evening and welcome to Constructive Conflict Management. Tonight is the fourth event hosted by the Town of Cochrane Social Recovery Task Force, and we are once again excited to be offering this important community conversation during these ever-changing times. My name is Deb Maxwell, and I'm a community liaison and programmer with Cochrane SCSS in the area of neighborhood inclusion. On behalf of the Social Recovery Task Force, I would like to welcome our guest speaker and thank all of you for joining us for this live discussion. The Social Recovery Task Force was established this May by the Town of Cochrane, Mayor and Council to assist in the social recovery of our community. The task force is responsible for creating opportunities to support and enhance the well-being, safety, and resilience of residents. The beginning work of the task force was focused on conducting an environmental scan to identify emerging needs and service gaps. The task force developed and implemented 2 surveys, one for nonprofit organizations and a survey for community residents to help us understand the social, emotional, and financial impacts of COVID-19. To take part in the second round of the survey, you can do so again right now if you would visit www.letstalkcochrane.ca/SRTF. We'll try to post that in the chat because that was a lot to maybe write down. Or you could look for a physical copy in the Cochrane Eagle this week. We have received a tremendous response to the survey, which has helped us identify several key areas that we, as a task force, could offer support to the community. We heard about financial struggles, challenges, and associated with isolation and the impact of not seeing friends and family. We heard about loneliness and the worry that people have for their own health and for the health of those that they love. However, we discovered that the pandemic brought about some positive changes to our community as well. We heard that the pandemic got people together to provide support and offer help to neighbors. We heard positives about the world slowing down and that the pandemic allowed us to focus on relationships and on our families, and that we had some time to try new activities and to do things on our list that we never seemed to get the chance to do. We took all of this information that we heard, and we are doing our best to respond. The task force has been offering monthly sessions to engage the community in conversation, to provide information and resources, and ensure that people have the knowledge and support that they require. Tonight, we will hear from Gary McDougall. Gary is the owner of Conflict Solutions. He does conflict resolution, communications, and is a negotiation expert. We will learn how our individual perceptions, assumptions, and mindset affect our thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes, and ultimately the outcome of our personal interactions. Gary's also a retired police officer who has served with the Calgary Police Service for 25 years. In the last 9 of his career, Gary was a member of the Hostage Crisis Negotiation Team. Following this 1-hour presentation, Gary will be available to answer any questions that you may have. You can ask your questions by emailing srtf@cochrane.ca or by putting them in the Facebook Live chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce Gary McDougall. Just the 2 of us here. So Gary, first, I'll just sanitize anything I've touched the station.
Right.
And it's all yours.
Thank you so very much.
You are very welcome.
One moment. There. Sorry, bear with me.
Gary, you're going to have to tell a joke or something.
Okay, so Carla Hoda walks into a bar.
She'll love that one. I do have a COVID joke for you, Gary.
COVID joke, you
Yes.
say?
I can tell it to you right now, but you're not going to get it for 2 weeks.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. And I told that one last time, so for those of you that are new, laugh away.
Nicely done. Nicely done.
Sorry, the writing was backwards. I'm just trying to fix it here. It's very strange.
How's that?
Thanks, Gary.
All right, thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks to Kim and to Deb Maxwell as well for the invitation, and to Family and Community Support Services here in Cochrane. I'm honored to be invited to spend some time here with you talking about constructive conflict management. And right off the hop, I was just wondering if you think this most recent pandemic and the things that are happening in our world are creating conflict. And I've got some specific examples of what that's looking like these days in terms of how people are in conflict, people are at odds as a direct result of what's happening here in our world, particularly over the wearing of masks. And we had a little bit of a chat before our session this evening to talk about what that looked like. So thanks so much for being part of our session here tonight. We've got about an hour's worth of material to talk about constructive conflict management. And I always try and start the session by making an assumption about those people who are signed up and who are listening online. And the assumption that I sometimes make is that you might not learn a whole bunch of new things about constructive conflict management during our session today. And if that disappoints you, let me apologize right up front. The reason I make that assumption is because, generally speaking, people are already pretty good at doing this. People are already pretty good at managing conflict. People are already pretty good at diffusing angry people. People are already pretty good at managing their own emotions in the face of a conflict. People are already good at managing their perceptions and their biases. So generally speaking, we bring to the table that skill set already. So if you do learn some new things, some new and different things, then that's great. I'm very happy about that. But what I really think we'll do in this presentation is underscore or punctuate those things that you're already doing really well. So that's kind of what brings us together here today. So let's jump into this material, constructive conflict management, and let's see where we end up with this. Now, off the hop, I like to talk specifically about perceptions and how perceptions sometimes contribute to conflict and conflict in our society, in our workplaces, in our interpersonal relationships. Because perceptions are oftentimes a big deal. Because in many cases, people's perception is their reality. It's their reality. And the question that I always like to ask when we start off this session, I like to ask the question, is anyone here, and if there was a room full of people here, I would ask, is anyone in this room a bad driver? And I've done this presentation many, many times, and I will tell you that almost never do people self-identify and put up their hand and say, oh, I'm a terrible driver. It almost never happens. In fact, we've got 3 in the room here now, and nobody here in this room is a bad driver. And I'd ask those of you who are watching the stream if you're bad drivers. And the reality is, people don't perceive that they're bad drivers. So I'll ask that question. Almost never do people say, oh yeah, I'm a terrible driver. What's interesting about that, though, is the fact so few of us are bad drivers. Admittedly, yet the reality is, on our streets, on our roads, there's reams and reams of people who are really, really bad drivers, which is kind of interesting. So none of us really perceive that we are that person, yet the reality is, oftentimes, some of us might be. So I want to go down that path a little bit further with you, and I want to talk about this date. Now, the date on the screen is 03/02/97. And I would ask you this, in your mind, what date is that? And some of you, I suspect, would say, I think that is March the 2nd, 97. And I suspect some of you would say, that's the 3rd of February, 97. And I would ask, well, what's the difference? The teaching point is this, is that we all look at exactly the same piece of information, and yet we draw different conclusions. We don't always see things in exactly the same way. And why is that? Well, it really speaks to our perceptions, Why do some of us see it as a March date and some of us see it as a February date? Why is that? Well, maybe it depends on where you went to school. Or maybe it depends on your country of origin, maybe your ethnicity. Because if you're American born, maybe you see that in a certain way. Or if you're European born, maybe you see that in a different way. But if you're truly a Canadian like many of us are, you just write that any darn way you want. We'll try and kind of figure it out, right? We don't so much have a format or a template. But what we really hope for is that one of these 2 numbers will be bigger than 12. Because when that happens, then we got it. So the teaching point is this, is that we look at exactly the same information, the same piece of data, the same event, and yet we see it in different ways. Why? Because we are all of different backgrounds, we bring different experiences, we have different biases, all of those kinds of things. So perceptions, pretty big deal in the context of constructive conflict management. So let's move down this path a little further, and I want to talk about components of every human interaction. Now, every human interaction, every conversation, every dialogue, every dispute, every engagement, every negotiation, in almost every case, there's 3 different levels or 3 different layers. And I think it's important to understanding the concept of conflict, to understand what those 3 different layers or those 3 levels look like. So let's unpack those individually and just take a real look. The first layer is something called an issue. Now, what is an issue? Well, it's the basis for the conversation. It's the basis for the conflict. It's the reason we got together to have that conversation. Now, whether it's a performance management issue, whether it's a punctuality issue, whether it's an attitude issue, the issue is the essence of this conflict or this conversation or this dialogue. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The second layer, the second level, is something that we call a position. Now, what is a position? Well, a position is the stance that you take versus the stance that the other person takes with respect to a particular issue or point of discussion. And maybe you've heard that term before. Boy, those people were being very, very positional. And what does that mean? Well, when someone is very positional, oftentimes they're very entrenched. They're very dug in. They're very intransigent. They're very strident. They're very opinionated. Sometimes they're very oppositional. And it's important that we recognize how, when people get positional, how that impacts the outcomes of our conversations or our disputes or our negotiations even. Okay? How do you know when someone's being positional? How do you know? Well, listen for the language that they're using. Because the language they're using is often very strong and very extortive language. You will, you can't, you shouldn't, you better not. If you do this, we will do that. That's how you know when someone's being very positional. Because they're very dug in and they're very oppositional. So we want to be mindful of that. We want to be mindful of the fact that we have a default response. That when people get positional with us, one of the things we very commonly default to is we get positional back with them. And so we hear, is that what you think? Well, if that's what you think, here's what we think. Oh yeah, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something different. So we end up being very positional. We take opposing and contrary positions to what other people take. And what happens is it oftentimes delivers a suboptimal outcome. I was in a business here in Calgary. I was in a business in Calgary, I was in a business in Calgary earlier this week. And I saw someone get in an argument or a dispute with one of the clerks in this particular business. And this person, this patron, this customer, walked into the business and they were wearing their mask. And the business owner, the proprietor of the business said, thank you for wearing your mask into our business. It's our policy. I will give you a clean mask because if you're going to be in our business, we want you to be wearing our mask. And the person said, well, I'm not going to wear your mask because I just put mine on and I feel more comfortable with my mask. And the proprietor said, well, you have to wear our mask, otherwise we're going to ask you to leave. And this person got very indignant and very positional as well, and said, well, you know what, you asked me to leave, I'll stand outside and I'll harass your customers and I'll tell them that this is not a business that they should visit. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And it was very angry, and it was very agitated, and it really escalated, and this person, this customer, ended up storming out of the business. And it didn't have to be that way. And in my view, it went that way because the proprietor got very positional and the customer got very positional. And so let's just not do that. Because when that happens, we destroy relationships. Because that proprietor wanted to serve that customer. And that customer wanted to be in that business. But what happened? Nobody won. We destroyed value because we got positional. So there has to be a better way for us. Instead of getting very positional in our conversations, our dialogues, our disputes, our conflicts, let's not do that. Let's instead take a different view or a different tact toward managing this conflict. And what will that look like? Well, I'm going to invite you to take a look at this bullet point here. And it says, instead of having conversations based on positions, let's instead try and get an understanding of what are people's underlying interests. What is an underlying interest? Well, historically we've thought that an interest was a hobby like horseback riding or snowboarding. Historically we've thought that an interest would be that. But the reality is an interest in the context of human communication and human relations and negotiation, an interest is this. What is it that's really, really important to the other side? What's really important? What are their concerns, their hopes, their expectations, their assumptions, their perceptions, their beliefs, fears, values, needs? Those things that drive people's behaviors are their underlying interests. And maybe in the past, or maybe in your training, you've heard of something called interest-based negotiation. And that's a negotiation format or a template whereby both sides have an opportunity to put on the table what's really important to them. And then we sift through all of those things and we try and find a solution that's workable for both folks. Okay? interest-based negotiation. The reasons or motivation a person has or holds that drives their behavior or supports their position is their underlying interest. So if you think of a tabletop as someone's position, the table legs would be their underlying interest. What supports their position, what upholds their position, it's their underlying interest. It's exactly what it is. So how do we unlock this? How do we get from a positional conversation to an interest-based conversation? How do we do that? Well, by asking coming from that place of inquiry, by asking a very specific, very strategic question. And the question is, you know what, sir, ma'am, you've taken a strong position with respect to this issue. Please help me understand why. And that's the transition, that's the place, that's the key that moves us from a positional conversation to an interest-based conversation. And I want to go back to that story I was sharing with you earlier, that example I shared earlier, in which the person was in a business and refused to wear their mask. And if that question had been asked, if somebody had just, instead of becoming very positional, if they had had some dialogue or some conversation, maybe that whole thing would have ended up in a different way. You know what, sir? Yeah, it sounds like you're not comfortable wearing our mask. Help me understand why that is. Because maybe there was a robust reason that that person did not want to move from his position. Maybe there is. So we get from a positional conversation to an interest-based conversation by asking that why question. And we'll talk about why in a minute, because sometimes people push back when we ask that why question. Sometimes that happens, because sometimes why can be perceived as a real personal challenge. So I'll give you a strategy in a few minutes to speak to that very thing, that why question. So issue, position, and interest. I gave you the list of interests earlier, and they're there: concerns and hopes, expectations and assumptions, perceptions, beliefs, fears, values, and needs. Those are incredibly powerful drivers behind our behaviors. Very, very powerful drivers behind our behaviors. So we talked about the tool. We talked about the transition tool to get from a positional conversation to an interest-based conversation. And the question was, why? Sir, ma'am, you've taken a strong position with respect to this issue. Please help me understand why. And if you don't get the information you're looking for based on that question, based on that inquiry, then maybe there's value in flipping that coin over. Because the other side of that coin asks why not. So it sounds like this is not going to be a workable solution for you. Sir, ma'am, why not? Okay, why or why not are excellent tools for us to transition or flip from a positional conversation to an interest-based conversation. And you'll note that the slide also says or asks, what else? And I think it's important for us to recognize that sometimes people have more than just one underlying interest. Sometimes there's more than just one thing at play. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, and important for us to honor that. Say, okay, I appreciate the fact that this is what's at play. What else? Is there anything else at play? Is there anything else that's driving this for you? Okay, why not, what else? The tools that we use to transition from a positional conversation to an interest-based. So we've been hammering at this why question. And I want to acknowledge the fact that sometimes the why question can get us in some trouble. Because sometimes the why question can be perceived as this real pushback, or it can be perceived as a personal challenge. Because if your boss, your supervisor, your manager comes to you and says, hey, I'd like you to do this task for me, and you say, why? That's a bad way for us to go, a really bad way for us to go. Because what does that do? Well, it fosters defensiveness, and it creates this real power imbalance. It's just not where we need to be. So if you don't like the question why, you've taken a strong position with respect to this issue, help me understand why, then ask it in a different way. Soften that up a little if you can. And ask, so you don't want to wear that mask, tell me more about that. Or share with me the reasons behind that if you're kind enough to do that. Okay? So for some people, why represents this real personal challenge. I really think from a conflict management perspective, I think that why question can be the most powerfully constructive or the most powerfully destructive word in our language. And I would ask you this, if anybody out there who's listening to this stream, if anybody there has a child who's 6 or 7 or 8, and you know that at bedtime, you know what happens at bedtime, where you say to your child, you know what, sweetie, it's 9 o'clock at night, it's time for bed. And very commonly the child will ask, why? And sometimes we get positional with our kids. Sometimes we say, well, because I said so, or I created you, I can rule you, right? Sometimes we say those kinds of things. But imagine this happening at your house tonight, where at 9 o'clock at night you say, sweetie, it's time for bed, and your child says, Mom, Dad, I gotta tell you, you've taken a strong position with respect to bedtime. Help me understand why. Like that's gonna happen at your house? I suspect not. I suspect not. But what does Y do though? Y represents this real nice opportunity for us to bring clarity to those people that we're interacting with. It allows us to cut from position to interest. Okay? Let's spend a little bit of time talking about tone in the context of constructive conflict management. Tone can be your very best friend, or tone can be your very worst enemy. Because tone conveys so many things. Tone conveys attitude. Tone conveys level of engagement. Tone conveys respect. Tone conveys level of interest. Tone conveys so much. And for those of you that have dogs, or a dog, think about tone in relation to your dog. Because you can say whatever you want to your dog, use the right tone, they're in. They're in. So say this to your dog. Hey, do you want to go to the vet and get a bunch of needles? Yeah, I'd love that. If you got time, let's go. Right? Because if you use the right tone, your dog's going to be engaged. Because that's what they listen to. That's what they listen for. So tone is a huge deal. And I bet you've heard this before. I bet you've heard this somewhere before. Hey, it's not so much what they said to me as how they said it. Tone is a huge deal. A huge deal. Because in many cases, and I said this a minute ago, tone equals attitude. And what is attitude? Well, it's the words they add to what you say. So if you use a real snooty tone to somebody and say, yeah, thanks for all your help, the word they add is jerk, or not such a nice word. So if you think about the concept of tone, and you factor in a little piece of emphasis, these are the two elements, these are the two pieces that allow us to manipulate the meaning of our message. Is changing your tone and adding some emphasis. Adding some emphasis. And what does that look like? Let me give you an example that supports this teaching point. And the example is this. I never said you weren't good at your job. And my colleague Kim is in the room, if I could use your good name, Kim. If I were to say to our colleague Kim, if I said, you know what, Kim, I never said you weren't good at your job. If I say that to Kim with no tone and with no emphasis, what does that mean? Well, it means just that. We take that right at face value. I never said you weren't good at your job. We take it at face value when it's absent tone and absent emphasis. We can manipulate the meaning of that message, though, by changing the tone and adding some emphasis. Because think about this. What does it mean when I say to our colleague Kim, when I say it this way? You know, Kim, I never said you were good at your job. What does that mean? Well, it means something entirely different. I didn't say it, other folks did. That's a different message. What if I say it this way? You know, Kim, I never said you weren't good at your job. Now what does that mean? Well, I didn't say it, but I thought it, I emailed it, and I wrote it on the wall in the bathroom. But I never said you weren't good at your job. Okay? That's another different message as well. What if I say it this way? You know, Kim, I never said you weren't good at your job. Now what does it mean? Well, it means something entirely different. So there's 4 different interpretations of exactly the same message just by changing the tone and adding a little piece of emphasis. And I have to say, folks, that this is the piece that gets us in trouble with email. Because with respect to email, there is no tone and there is no emphasis. And so what do? Well, we're left to make assumptions. So what have we done societally? Well, we've created little tools to keep us safe with email. We have, with the little LOL or the little emojis, the little happy face. What does the little happy face mean? Well, it means I don't think you're smart enough to know I was kidding, so I put a little happy face in there. Or LOL, what does it mean? Well, it means laugh out loud, or little old lady, or low on liquor, I don't know. But what we've done is we've created those little emojis or those little sayings to keep us safe with respect to email. And it's all about the whole concept of tone. You shift or change the meaning of your message when you change the tone and you add a little piece of emphasis. So let's just change gears here for a second and let's talk for a second about managing your own emotions. Now, if I had to ask you this question, what is the emotion that gets us in trouble the most? I bet many of you would say, I think anger. Because I think anger gets us in trouble a bunch. And in fact, I would completely agree with that. And if you think about why anger gets us in trouble, well, it gets us in trouble for this reason. Well, for a number of reasons, including the fact that anger is often very reciprocal. Sometimes when we get angry with people, they get angry back with us. Sometimes anger causes us to say things that we didn't mean. Or sometimes anger causes us to say things that we actually did mean, but what it was, it just took that anger to push us over that precipice. And the other piece around anger and why it sometimes gets us in trouble, it's for this reason. It's because there is an inverse relationship What does that mean? Like a teeter-totter. An inverse relationship that exists between anger, so emotionality, and rationality. Think about that. The higher you go on that emotion scale, the lower you go on that reason or that rationality scale. That's an inverse relationship. So anger gets us in trouble in many, many cases for those kinds of reasons. So let's talk a little bit about managing our emotions in the face of conflict. And what does this look like? Well, it has been said, and we're covering old ground here because I think this is probably a very familiar concept to people. Anger is the most misunderstood and overused of the human emotion. And that only makes some sense if we put some context around it. Now, what is the context that explains this for us? It says this, is that anger is a response to an inner emotion and not a planned action. So what are we saying here? Well, what we're saying is that generally speaking, we as human beings do not experience anger as a primary emotion. Think about that. In almost every case, anger for us is the secondary emotion. So how does that show up? Well, we get frustrated and it shows up as anger. We get disappointed, it shows up as anger. We get embarrassed, it shows up as anger. We feel threatened and it shows up as anger. In almost every case, anger is that secondary emotion. So think about a brand new baby. The very second a brand new baby is born, they look really, really angry because they scream and they cry and they kick their feet and they pound their fists. A brand new baby's not angry. They're not angry. What are they? Well, they're scared and they're uncertain and they're vulnerable and they're not really sure what are the terms of engagement out here. What am I supposed to do? What does this look like? Or they're hungry or they're just feeling really, really frightened. But what emotion shows up? It's that of anger. Think about anger as this mask that we put on to cover up the true emotion that we're actually experiencing. And think about the last time you were really angry. And now take a step back. And I bet you weren't angry. I bet you were frustrated. Or I bet you were disappointed. Or I bet you were embarrassed. Or I bet you were feeling vulnerable. Or maybe you were feeling jealous or insecure. Think about that for a second. And let me ask you this. Why is it all of those emotions take us to a place that looks like anger? Why, whether we're frustrated or disappointed or embarrassed or feeling threatened, why do all of those places take us to a place that looks like anger? Anger is the destination. Why? Well, I think it's because those primary emotions, those things that take us to that place that looks like anger, okay, they cause us to feel disempowered. Because if you're embarrassed, you're disempowered. If you're feeling threatened, you're disempowered. If you're feeling jealous or vulnerable or insecure, you're disempowered. So what do we do when we're feeling disempowered? What do? Well, we as a species, we strive to regain that level of empowerment. And how do we do that? Well, anger is an excellent tool to cause us to feel like, yeah, okay, I've got a little control here. That works very well for us on the short term. Long term, probably not a good outcome, or probably not a good place for us to be. So we do that, we go to that place of anger, in my opinion, because we want to regain that level of empowerment. So a little bit more about anger and managing our emotions. A lot of people use anger as the default emotion. Regardless of the emotion, we call it anger. Why do you think that is? Why? Why don't we just call it what it really is? Well, I think we don't do that for this reason. I think because it's safe for us to tell people that we're angry. Because I can't imagine being in my workplace and saying to someone, hey, you know what, I'm feeling very vulnerable today. Or boy, oh boy, am I ever feeling insecure today. Like I can't imagine, for me anyway, saying that in my workplace. So it's safe for us to tell people we're angry. In many cases, it's not safe for us to share what is that primary emotion. What is it that's driving that piece? So I always ask this question in a workshop. I ask the question, do you think human emotions are a big deal? I think that the answer is yes. Human emotions are a huge deal. You think about the impact of human emotions on us. What is the impact? Well, do you think our emotions impact our interpersonal relationships? In a huge way. Do you think our emotions impact our professional relationships? In a huge way. Do our emotions impact our productivity in the workplace? In a huge way. So emotions are a big deal. And a big piece of why emotions are a big deal, it's for this reason here. It's because so often what happens for us is we treat our emotions as if they're the truth. We treat our emotions as if they're the truth. So if my colleague Nicole and I are in an argument or in a dispute, and things are starting to get very, very heated and it's just not going very well, and I start to feel disrespected, the assumption I make is Nicole meant to disrespect me, because that's what I feel. And we use our emotions as a currency. If I feel disrespected, if I feel slighted, if I feel hurt, if I feel embarrassed during this engagement with Nicole, the assumption I make is that that was her intent. So we build that bridge, we make that connection. And you know what? That might be a little crazy, because what we're doing here is we are drawing a conclusion based on an assumption. And anytime you draw a conclusion based on an assumption, the outcome you're going to get potentially will be a suboptimal outcome, a suboptimal outcome. So we use our emotions as if they're currency. So let's move forward. I'm just going to grab a drink of water, with your permission, and then we're going to move forward. I want to talk about this concept called I see your point. It's a super, super simple four-word phrase in our language, and it's I see your point. And I always ask people in these workshops, I say, do you think that when we say to somebody, if we are in conflict with somebody, or we're having a dispute or some sort of a disagreement, is there value in saying to people, you know what, I can see your point here? And if so, what is that value? And I would respectfully suggest to you that the value comes from this. When you say to somebody, I see your point, you're not saying to them, oh, you're right and I'm wrong. You're not giving anything up. You're not abandoning your position. You're not doing that at all. When you say to somebody, I see your point, what that is a recognition of the fact, an acknowledgement of the fact that they've got a point. And you're very happy to acknowledge that and recognize that. You're not saying I agree with you or you're right and I'm wrong. You're not doing that at all. So when we say this to people, I see your point, I think that it brings value, because I think that it sends a really positive message, a really, really positive message. So in conflict, let's try to acknowledge the point that the other person makes. Let's do that. If you think about why it's a value for this reason. Is because you are satisfying someone's most basic of human needs. Most basic. Because I hearken back to a colleague who's been around years and years and years and years. 150 years ago, there's a gentleman named Maslow. And Maslow came up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he thought, wow, it would be pretty cool is if we were to prioritize our human needs. What is it that's most important to us? What is it that's least important to us? And so 150 years ago, Maslow came up with this pyramid. And at the very base, he plugged in our most important basic human needs, which are food, shelter, air, water, and Molson's Canadian. And he plugged those in. And once that level of need was satisfied, then we would progress up to the second level. And what is the second level of need? Well, is our need for safety, our need for security, safety of our family, safety of our financial future, those kinds of things. And when those two levels of need were satisfied, our third most basic driving need is our need for what? Our need for acknowledgement, our need for connection, our need for humanity, our need for alignment. So if you believe Maslow, and he's been around a long, long time, if you believe in what he said, we can satisfy someone's third most basic need just by saying, you know what, I can see your point here. I can see your point here. And as I said a minute ago, it doesn't mean that you're giving anything up. You're not saying you're right and I'm wrong. You're not doing that. You're just saying, I want to recognize and acknowledge the fact that you too have a point. So there are three caveats associated, I think, to using this term, I see your point. And the first one is this, is that you need to be sincere. Because if you're not sincere, if you don't see their point, then please don't play that card. Because people will see through that. If you say, oh yeah, I see your point, when in fact you don't see their point, it will impact the relationship, it will impact rapport, it will impact your credibility. So let's not play that card unless we are being sincere. The second caveat associated to this is it's important to add some substance to what their point actually is. Okay, it brings no value. It brings no value if you just say I see your point, because that's an unskilled place to be. So add some meat and potatoes. So as an example, I would say, you know what? I see your point, Corey Lahota. You're really frustrated by the fact that it took me 2 weeks to respond to your emails. So plug that in there, put that in there, add some meat and potatoes to what their point actually is. And then the third and probably most important point, or most important condition associated to I see your point is this. Please don't say to people, I see your point, but. Because if you think about that, what does it mean when you say to someone, I see your point, but? Well, you're discounting, you're dismissing everything that was said before the word but. Because we think the word but is a connecting word. When the reality is, it's not a connecting word, it's a canceling word. Like, I used to hear this in high school all the time. People would say to me, yeah, Gary, I'd love to go to the dance with you, but I'd rather have a root canal. Or they'd say those kinds of things. Okay? So we think that the word but is a connecting word, and it's not. It's a canceling word. We think the word but connects two independent thoughts, both of which are correct. And it doesn't do that. It dismisses, it discounts everything that was said before the word but. Let's go down this path a little bit further. We also know that but sets up this adversarial or sometimes an oppositional relationship between the first half of the sentence and the second half of the sentence. And it doesn't give equal value to both halves of that sentence. As an example, if I were to say to my colleague, Deb Maxwell, you did a great job on that year-end report, but you should have put those statistics in. What part of that communication does Deb hear? Oh, I really dropped the ball. I didn't put those statistics in. And what a shame that is. What an absolute shame that is. Why? Because if you truly believe Deb did a great job on that year-end report, she doesn't hear it. Because as soon as you use the word but, she forgets everything that was said before. And that's a shame. That's a real shame. We also know that the word but is a great eraser. Because if you're going to say to somebody, you know, you did a great job on that year-end report, but you might as well take out a big eraser and erase everything that was said before the word but. Because what does but do? Well, it often precedes a real negative message. So instead of using the word but, what might we use? Well, in these workshops, commonly when I ask that question, people put up their hand and they say, oh, I don't say but, I say however. And I say, well, you know what, friend, that's kind of the same word. That's the fancy cousin. And then somebody else in the workshop room will say, oh, I don't say but, and I don't say however, I say this. I say, having said that. Well, that's a real fancy cousin to the word but. It really, really is. But the message is exactly the same. Exactly the same. Those are both canceling words. So what I would suggest to you respectfully is that maybe, instead of using the word but, maybe we're looking for an inclusive word instead of an exclusive word. And what might that word be? Well, how about the word and? So use and to cover your but. Why does that work? Well, because we're looking to add on to something that someone said as opposed to detract from it. So back to the Deb Maxwell example. You know, Deb, you did a great job on that year-end report, but you should have put those statistics in. I don't think that's where we want to go. Deb, you did a great job on that year-end report, and once we put those statistics in, we're great to move forward. Okay? So and is a much more productive word in my view because it's a connecting word. Now, sometimes it doesn't fit. Sometimes it doesn't. It causes the sentence to bog down and not flow very well. And so if that happens for you, then just use a period. Just end that sentence. Just make it two separate and distinct thoughts. Deb, you did a great job on that year report, period. You know, we might want to get those statistics in before we submit that report to Kim. Okay, when we compartmentalize that personal, that positive thought, at least Deb Maxwell gets the value of that positive thought. And if you don't think that this is a very powerful communication strategy, I'm going to give you an example that supports this teaching point. Now, many of you have probably used a cold medication that's been available in our country, in Canada, for 101 years. 101 years. And the company that manufactures this cold medication, they're called Buckley's Mixture. And for 100 years, 101 years this year, in fact, okay, they have been using a tagline. They've been using a byline that contained the word but. And for years and years and years, they've said, it tastes awful, but it works. This year, they've changed it. And I offer you this example. Now they say, it tastes awful and it works. Why would they do that? I think they would do that because they want to make that an inclusive statement instead of an exclusive statement. Since 1919, they have had that tagline. Okay, let's move forward. I want to talk about 3 levels of conversation as it relates to constructive conflict management. And I know we talked earlier about issues, positions, and interests. Okay, now that was three different components of every conflict, and this is a little bit different. But let me just roll these 3 levels of conversation out and just give you a sense or some context for where we're going with this next module. Sometimes we communicate based on an information level exchange. Sometimes we communicate based on an emotional level exchange. And sometimes we communicate based on what's called the identity level. Now let's unpack these individually. What is an information level conversation? Well, that's Nicole and I swapping factually based information. Okay? I say to Nicole and she says to me, and I say to her and she said, you know, Gary, we weren't really there, so we probably shouldn't comment on that. Yeah, I think you're probably right, Nicole. We are swapping factually based information. And there's no real risk, there's no real exposure associated to Nicole and I swapping information based on that information level conversation. Now, these don't get us in much trouble. The next level is called an emotional level conversation. And that's Nicole and I swapping factually based information. And in the context of that communication, in the context of that exchange, there is an emotional component to it. So I say to Nicole, and Nicole says to me, she says, you know, Gary, when my husband comes home from work, leaves all his stuff by the back door, I get so mad I could scream. Okay? It's information, and there's an emotional component to it as well. And those conversations typically don't get us in a lot of trouble. The one we want to talk about, though, is this one here, because this one represents a real slippery slope. Something called an identity level conversation. What is an identity level conversation? Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody, and in the context of that conversation, they said something to you, they made a comment to you, they said something that caused you to be immediately angry and immediately offended? Because if that's ever happened to you, I would bet dollars to donuts that that contained some element of an identity level conversation. Okay? An identity level conversation. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. My colleague Nicole. If I were to say to Nicole, you know what, Nicole, and I would never say this, I never ever would, you know what, Nicole, you're a liar. Because if I said that to Nicole, how do you think Nicole would receive that? Probably not very well. Probably not very well. And I would never, ever, ever say that to somebody. Why? Because that's a direct attack on her identity. Now, I don't know Nicole very well, but what I do know of Nicole is I think that she has some pretty significant core values. And I think Nicole's core values, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, I think your core values are probably things like honesty, integrity, respect, ethics, fairness, compassion, commitment. Does that speak to who you are, Nicole? I think it does. I think it does. And so then when I say to Nicole, you know, you're a liar, that's like an arrow through the heart of that very identity, those things that she holds dear. Or if I said, you know what, Nicole, you're a terrible mom and you got bad kids, like we would fight. Why? Because that's a direct attack on her identity. Like, she's not defined by the fact that she has children, but the reality is that's a pretty big part of our world, right? A pretty big part of our world. So when we get triggered at that identity level in the context of conflict, what happens? Well, we go from 0 to 200 in a hurry. We go from 0 right up to 200. Why? Well, because it's a personal attack on our identity. I did this very workshop for a group of 911 dispatchers in a city not far from here, not long ago. And during the course of this presentation, this module, I was giving this example, and one of the 911 dispatchers put up their hand and said, I've got an example that supports your teaching point if you'd like to hear it. And I said, absolutely. And this dispatcher said, in the work that we do, when people call 911 in certain situations or in certain circumstances, we are required by protocol to ask a specific question that oftentimes causes people to get so incredibly offended. And think about what that question might be. That question is this: have you been drinking? And that is the question that causes people to get so incredibly offended, so incredibly offended. Why is that? Well, because there's an underlying or implicit message associated to have you been drinking. Because we associate a certain set of behaviors, we associate a certain set of assumptions when we say to somebody, hey, have you been drinking? Have you been drinking? So if you think about why that might get us in trouble, well, that's exactly right. So sometimes inadvertently and accidentally and innocuously, innocently, we trigger people at that identity level. And so we need to have a tool for how to manage that. And what does that look like? Well, this would be my recommendation for you. Let's be very clear with people about our intent, and let's be curious about our impact. And when I say be clear about our intent, for our 911 friend, perhaps she could have said, hey, you know what, I don't want to offend you. I'm required by protocol to ask this very question. So please don't be offended. I need to ask you this. Have you been drinking? So we're very clear about our intent. And then let's get curious. If we get an adverse response, let's get curious about our impact. Wow, it sounds like I've really offended you. Let's have a conversation about that. Let's have some dialogue about that. Information level conversations don't really get us in much trouble. Emotional level, not so much. Identity level tend to get us in some trouble. So I'd like to move to effective communication in the context of conflict management. Now, I'm going to suggest very respectfully that some of us have a bit of a misguided understanding, a misguided belief of what true effective communication means. What does that look like? Well, during conflict or during even just basic human communication, you have a choice. And the choice is this. There are two different strategies you can use. You can subscribe to one of two different strategies in the context of your communication. And the strategies are, you can subscribe to communication of advocacy, communication strategy of advocacy, which means you giving information. Excuse me, or conversely, you can come from a place of inquiry. And those are your two choices, advocacy or inquiry. And I suggest to you very respectfully, when we feel strongly about something, when we really, really like something, when we have a strong opinion about something, as we often do during the course of a conflict, oftentimes we'll default to that place of advocacy, whereby we're giving information. And the downside to operating in that theater is that while you are talking, you don't learn anything you didn't already know. So the other side of that coin is maybe coming from a place of inquiry, coming from a place of curiosity, whereby we are seeking information. We talked about that why question. Why not? What else? Tell me more about that. Help me understand. Coming from a place of inquiry is a very powerful communication tool, and I think it fits very well in the context of constructive conflict management. I'd like to give you an example that illustrates what this looks like and a specific application of this. Now, I have a long-term training contract with a company down in the United States, in a specific state in the United States. And I work for a company down there, which is an organ donation company. And it doesn't matter what the name of the company is, it's an organ donation company. And what they do at this organ donation company is they staff the hospitals around their city and around the entire state with people that do this for a living. They sit around the hospitals 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you know what they're waiting for? They're waiting for people to die. That's what they're waiting for. And then when that happens, they immediately go to the family and they say, we're really sorry about your loss. We'd love to have a conversation with you that feels a little bit risky to us. It's a conversation about organ donation. If you think the conversations that you have or the conflicts that you have in your world are difficult, I would suggest to you that these are tough ones. These are tough ones. So one particular hospital I'd been doing some work with, a specific group of work. And there were, at this hospital, there were two identical donation teams. And they were identical in terms of structure, in terms of function, resource, training. Okay, they were identical in almost every way. The hospital was doing an efficiency audit to try and get a sense, how effective is our program? Are we doing well? Are we not doing well? Could we do better? Let's talk about what this looks like. And through that audit, they discovered that these two different teams had entirely different outcomes. They discovered that Team 1 experienced a 15% consent rate, or a 15% donation rate. And they thought, wow, that's a pretty small number. And then they looked at the other team that worked in the same hospital and discovered they had a 70% donation rate. And the administrator said, how can this possibly be? How can two teams that are identical in structure, function, training, purpose, resource, how can they possibly have such diverse outcomes? We need to take a look at this. And so they did. That's what they did. They decided they were going to follow these two teams around and get a sense of what is the approach. What approach are they using? So they first of all followed this group here, this Team 1. And this was their approach. These folks went to the family and they said, we are from the organ procurement group and we are so sorry for your loss. Indeed, we are so sorry. We believe organ donation is a wonderful process. What an opportunity this would be for your deceased loved one to make a difference in the life of somebody who badly, badly needs organs. Because we think it would be amazing if you allowed us to take the corneas from your deceased loved one's eyes and transplant those corneas into the eyes of somebody who's presently blind. Imagine, if you will, your loved one giving sight to someone who's presently blind. And imagine how amazing it would be if you allowed us to take the liver from your deceased loved one's body and transplant that liver into the body of somebody who's been on that liver transplant list for who knows how long. What an opportunity this would be. And we think it would be amazing if you allowed us to take the heart from your deceased loved one's chest and transplant that heart into the body of somebody who's been on that heart transplant list for who knows how long. What an opportunity this would be. This would represent a little piece of your loved ones still alive on this planet. Organ donation is amazing. It's phenomenal. How about it? And 15% of those people said, yeah, make the bad man stop, but okay. Why 15%? Well, here's why. Because they came from a place of advocacy. And when you come from a place of advocacy, there's no idea, no accounting for people's concerns and hopes, expectations and assumptions, perceptions, beliefs, fears, values, and needs. You just don't get it. You just completely miss it. Coming from that place of advocacy, not an effective communication strategy in the context of a high-level conflict management process. So the hospital decided, well, we better take a look at the other team and let's see how they're doing. And you can see where we're headed with this, because this is exactly what happened. Is they went to the family and they said to the family, we're from the organ procurement group and we're so sorry for your loss. Indeed, we are so sorry. What do you know about organ donation? What have you heard about organ donation? Do you know anybody who's ever been the recipient of a donated organ? And I guess the big question is this, is what barriers exist that would keep you from participating in our program? What are your concerns? And then they just listened. Oh, okay. What I hear you say is that you and your family have decided you want to have an open casket funeral. And you're concerned that if we procure organs from your deceased loved one, that will in some way inhibit your ability to have an open casket funeral. Let me give you just a tiny piece of information. Anything that we take from your loved one by way of organ procurement, we replace with a prosthetic piece. So this wouldn't in any way inhibit your ability to have an open casket funeral. What other concerns have you got? Oh, okay. What I hear you say is that you and your family have heard that we procure these organs from your loved one and then we sell them to other patients in other hospitals. And we make a huge, huge profit for our hospital by selling organs or tissue from your loved one. You know, a lot of people, once again, have that same misperception. Let me give you a tiny bit of information. There's a law in our state, in fact, there's a law in every state, that prohibits us from making a profit based on the sale of human organs or tissue. Legally, we could not sell your loved one's organs. Morally and ethically, we wouldn't have to tell you that. Any other concerns? Nothing? Well, we're the organ procurement group, and if you're interested, we'd love to have you. And 70% of those people said, wow, that's a great program, sign us up, let's do this right now. And why do you think 70% of those people signed up? Because the folks came from a place of inquiry, and they asked the right questions, and they showed the requisite empathy, and they did the things, you know, that family, in my view, really needed at that time. So here's the teaching point, is that when you are in conflict, what you really want to do is come from that place of inquiry. Let me tell you how it's going to be. Let me tell you, let's do this my way. Whereas maybe, and I know this is counterintuitive, maybe there's value for us in coming from that place of inquiry. Or maybe there's value in us finding a balance between those two things, advocacy and inquiry. Because I'm not going to stand here before you today and tell you that we should never advocate. Because we do. We advocate sometimes. I'll tell you, if this building ever caught on fire, I'd say, this building's on fire. Kim, we got to go. We got to go. That's advocacy. I'm not going to say, Kim, this place is on fire. What are your thoughts on fire? Kim, have you ever been burned? Like, what's your favorite color? Do you like orange or blue fire? No. Where time permits, where it's respectful, and where it's appropriate, like in the face of a conflict or a difficult engagement, coming from that place of inquiry is a very, very powerful communication tool. Very powerful. There it is. 15% versus 70. The last piece I want to spend some time talking about, I want to talk a little bit about, diffusing angry people. Now, if what you're doing now is working, if what you've been doing and it's been successful and it's working for you, I would invite you, in fact, I would encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. Because a lot of different people historically have used a lot of different strategies for diffusing angry people, a lot of different people. And sometimes I hear people using these pieces. Calm down, you better relax. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on calm down, you better relax. And I suspect you're shaking your head saying, probably not. Why not? What is wrong with calm down and you better relax? Well, that's a little like pouring gas on a fire. And the other thing is that is absolute advocacy. That's not inquiry at all. It's advocacy. And if those don't work for you, maybe try these. Chill out, simmer down, take a pill, let it go. Are you through? What's your problem? And whatever. Like, you hear people use those in the context of trying to diffuse someone who's angry. And once again, maybe not. Maybe not. Why? Because once again, it's advocacy. Except for these two, are you through yet? And what's your problem? Those are questions. Those are inquiries. And I would suggest to you respectfully that those are what we call false inquiry questions. It's like, how long have you been an idiot? Right? It sounds like a question. It's not a question at all. It's a statement. It's a question. If you're hiding advocacy inside inquiry, you're pretending to ask a question. It's not a question. Like, where are you going to pick up the kids after school? Where are you going to take out the trash? Okay, those are false inquiry questions. What do you want when you're angry? I bet you want to be heard. I bet you want to be listened to, and I bet you want to be validated, and I bet maybe you might want your problem solved as well, or you might want the substantive issue looked after as well. Okay, and this just doesn't do it. When you're angry, you want to be heard, listened to, and validated, and this is a little bit more like pouring gas on a fire. So in terms of diffusing and de-escalating, really inflammatory. Calm down, you better relax, take a pill, are you through yet? What's your problem? Because what you're doing in essence is you are criticizing the other person's behavior. You are playing a judgment card of their behavior. And think about that for a second. There's this underlying or implicit message that they have no right to the feelings and the emotions they're experiencing. So when you tell people, calm down and you better relax, what you do in essence is you are creating some multiple other problems, some problems that you didn't have before. And think about what that looks like. A minute ago, this was the only problem you had, right here. This was the substantive problem, this was the conflict, this was the source of the conflict. Okay? And now you play that judgment card, calm down, you better relax. Well, this hasn't gone away because this is still very real and still very much on the table. But now people feel the need to defend their reaction as well because you played that judgment card. And the third problem you've just created is this, is a minute ago, they were mad at the substantive issue. Well, who are they mad at now? Well, they're mad at you. You have functionally shifted the focus from what the substantive issue was to you. You've personalized it by playing this judgment card. So a minute ago you had one problem, now you've got three. So if we're looking to diffuse or to de-escalate, we're really kind of going the wrong way. We're moving down a path that's not where we want to be. So we said this a minute ago. What do you want when you're angry? I want to be heard, listened to, and validated, and I might want my problem solved. Sometimes I do, sometimes I just want to vent. In the context, under the umbrella of communication skills, there's one specific communication skill under the umbrella of active listening skills. And the active listening skill that you're probably very familiar with is something called the skill of paraphrasing. And what is a paraphrase? Well, you listen to what they say, you process their information, and then when it's appropriate, you give them back the information they've given to you in your words. And we do that because we want to prove that we were listening. In fact, I was listening so well, I can give you back your message in my words. And the paraphrase is that piece. And that satisfies our requirement to let them know, hey, I heard what you said. I heard what you said. So I think that using the strategic skill of paraphrasing is a really powerful tool when we want to diffuse somebody who's really angry. So here's what it looks like, is we listen to what they say without interruption. We don't want to interrupt somebody who's angry because interruption is not conducive to rapport building. So we listen to what they say without interruption, and when it's appropriate, when they pause or when they defer, we process their information and paraphrase back what they have said. And then we take a sense of, try to take stock of where they are. Because if they're still really out of balance based on that teeter-totter we talked about earlier, we do that again. We listen to what they say, we process their information, and we give it back to them. And then, and only then, we go to problem solving. But what I see time after time after time is I see people going to problem solving way too soon. And I'm going to suggest to you respectfully, you have to earn the right to go to problem solving. And how do you do that? By letting them know, hey, I got what you said. So paraphrase, and then and only then we'll problem solve. Okay. We want to move with the angry person. And that's exactly what the paraphrase does. We are not taking a contrary position. And the beauty of the paraphrase is it keeps that communication in their frame of reference. That communication is still very much about them. And when we paraphrase back their information, it keeps us from sticking our story into their story. So let's, for now, let's let this be all about them. So in essence, we're moving with the angry person, not against them as they would expect. And then once emotion calms, like we talked about before, then what happens? Well, reason returns. And we move to a better place. We move to a better place. So I'm wondering if there's anything from my colleagues, because that's really all I have. And here's probably your favorite slide of the day. It's thank you for your time and attention. And I want to say a big warm thank you to my friends and colleagues from Family and Community Support Services here in Cochrane. And thank you for all you've done, and thank you for you, those of you who are watching from home or on the live stream. Thank you for being wonderful participants in our session. I think maybe you've all fallen asleep. I don't know, but it's been my pleasure and it's been my honor to be here. And that's really all I have to say. And I think that Maxwell might have some closing comments. Is my assumption.
First of all, thank you, Gary. We have a thank you for you.
I didn't get you anything. Thank you.
Well, Christmas is coming.
Oh, it is indeed. There's an opportunity. Thank you so very much.
And I'm going to just sit back and ask you some questions. So you can remove your mask.
Okay.
You're all sanitized up there.
All
And
right.
we have a couple of questions that have come in as you were talking.
Okay.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I think that I learned a lot even as a parent. Can diffuse situations now with my teenage children.
Wow.
Do you have workshops for youth or a way that this kind of has language that they understand?
I will say that you can negotiate with terrorists, not with teens.
Okay, so that's a different lecture.
That's for another day. Yeah.
Well, and it was interesting that you talked a lot about like emails and texting and emojis. So when the world is in a place right now of everything's virtual, a lot of email and texting, you can add an emoji, but until you have that tone of voice. So what would you recommend for the world that is immersed in their laptops right now?
Super good question, particularly now, right, as you've said.
Yes.
I think what's really important here is let's be clear about our intent and curious about our impact. Going back to that 3 levels of conversation we talked about, I think that we want to be very explicit, and I think that we want to be very careful to not step on toes, or very careful to not create a situation in which potentially they could misconstrue what it is that you're saying. So let's be very clear about our intent. And if people push back, let's get curious about our impact, just exactly like we talked about that identity level conversation. Because now more than ever, at Maxwell, we have to be super careful with that piece of communication.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm no expert, but eventually there's a limit to the texting or the emailing. So to communicate, I think you have to have a good old-fashioned phone call and pick up the phone.
Wow.
So that so much isn't lost.
Yeah.
You can laugh with a person. So in these times of COVID and virtual exchange.
You bet. Or Zoom, or Teams, or WebEx, or any of those other kinds of platforms, exactly where we need to be. You're absolutely right.
Can resolve a lot of conflict.
Indeed we can. Look at you.
Mm-hmm. We had a question that came into the chat. So, Gary, what if you see somebody's point, you see their point, but you really disagree? So you don't want to say the words, I see your point, even though you do, because you disagree with it.
Mm-hmm. I'm inclined to name that behavior. You know what, I see your point. I want to recognize and acknowledge the fact that you do have a point and a perspective. I see this a little differently, and I would use provisional language is what I would use. Instead of, no, that's not right at all. That's absolute language. I'm inclined to use provisional language. Wow, I respect the fact, I take your point. I see it a bit differently. May I share my perspective with you? And I would use that provisional language as opposed to absolute language. So yeah, no, you're wrong versus, wow, okay, let's explore that a little bit. And that just opens the door, keeps the door open for some dialogue.
And that's difficult to do when you're live.
Indeed.
And to think in the moment and not escalate or say but.
Right.
So how do we practice these skills?
Well, I think the first step to any kind of a behavior change, Deb Maxwell, is in acknowledgement, in recognition, in awareness. First step to any behavior change is about awareness. So keep it in the forefront of your head. Hang on a second. It's counterproductive or counterintuitive to me. This person's yelling and screaming at me. I want to advocate back. Don't do that. Don't do that. Because when you're at your very bad, when you're at your very worst, we tend to default to those advocacy kinds of places. And when people are really angry with us, It's so the hardest thing to do is to think, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to come from that place of skill. I'm going to come from that place of inquiry. I'm going to come from that place of managing my emotions. I'm going to come from that place. And it's the hardest thing to do. The hardest thing to do. When you want to strike back and you can't do it. Because at the end of the day, what do you want? You want some sort of a workable resolution. And it just won't work if they get positional and you get positional and they get positional. It just won't work.
And isn't it almost like a natural reflex, like a fight or flight, to be defensive even if you're not defensive? So if somebody brings like that conflict to you, and it's just an emotion that happens automatically. So especially with the COVID world right now, and you're distance in lineups, and you're trying to follow the rules. So how do you keep like that awareness or that trigger? Do you have something that happens to you that you won't go straight to those instincts?
No, I don't.
You don't?
Other than that level of awareness. Other than that, you know what, here's what I feel like doing. I probably shouldn't do that. I probably should do something different. Something different.
Okay, so you don't have like a word you say?
I'd have given it to you in the workshop. I would have, if there was some magic, I would have given it to you.
What? We paid for magic? We're
I'm
not
holding
going to
it
get
back.
magic?
I'm holding it back, yeah.
Okay, the next question is a little bit political. So let's see if I get this right. So when someone supports Trump and I see differently, how do I deal with that? So the election that just happens, and you are in a discussion, I'm assuming, and there's a Trump supporter and you see differently.
Mhm.
So this one's like a scenario for you.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's have a conversation about that.
What?
Instead of Trump, Biden, Trump, Biden, Trump, Biden, Trump, why? What do you see? What have you seen? What is it you like about him, or what do you like about President-elect Biden? What works for you? Let's have that conversation. Let's make that explicit instead of implicit, as opposed to a positional conversation. I like Trump, I like Biden, I like Trump, I like Biden. Not much value in that. Because when you're doing that, you don't learn anything. So if somebody is a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter, I'd be very interested. I'd come to that place of curiosity, and I'd try and get a sense of what's driving that. What evidence have you seen that moves you down that path? I am open to being influenced to see your position. I'm absolutely open to that, is what I would do. Have a conversation.
Have a conversation. So what I'm hearing overall is get curious.
Get curious.
Interested.
Come from
in
a place of
people.
inquiry. Absolutely.
Inquiry.
Words to live by.
Nicole, do we have any other questions?
No more questions.
No more
Just lots of
questions.
thanks and great presentation and well done.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Gary,
you.
very
Thanks
much.
for the-
And Cochrane, thank you for joining us again. And stay tuned if we have any more in the speaker series. And please keep safe. Thank you again, Gary.
Thanks so much.